All right, let's talk about the palette here. This is my studio palette, and I use pretty much the same colors if I'm working outdoors as I do in the studio. If I'm doing some figurative work, there are a few other colors that I'll add, things like raw umber or maybe a zinc white. But this is the palette that I use for pretty much everything I paint, uh, particularly landscape, which is my main focus. So we'll start on the left here. This first color is a Rembrandt color. And by the way, I'm going to tell you the brand names, not because I'm paid to, uh, I wish I was, but because whenever you change from one brand to another, it may not be the same pigment. There's no standardization in the paint manufacturing industry. So burnt sienna from company A will be often completely different than burnt sienna from company B. So I'm just going to tell you the names of the brands that I use, and whatever brand you choose, just make sure you're buying artist grade, not student grade. A lot of folks when they're beginning, they'll tell me, well, I'll use student grade until I get better, and then I'll switch. And I think that's a mistake because uh, not only are you not learning true color mixing because the tinting strength is weaker, but you're also not learning paint handling because the tactile quality of the paint, how thick it is, how sticky it is, how it lays down, all those things will change as well. So even if you're just starting out, I recommend you go with an artist grade paint. And if you don't have 37 different colors, it's really not that expensive anyway. All right, back to the palette. The first color here, cold gray, that's a Rembrandt color. And it's called cold gray, but I actually think of it as kind of a dirty green. It's actually warmer than it looks when you use it. And if you're new to painting, I wouldn't even worry about this color. It's actually better to learn to mix your own grays using complements. And I still do that most of the time. This you can see there's just a little bit of this color on there. Sometimes if I just want a shortcut for graying something down a little bit, I'll grab a little bit of that. But if I'm starting a passage that's a fairly gray color, I prefer to mix that so that I get to control whether that's warm or cool, and and the value as well. So on to the next color, ultramarine blue. This is my workhorse blue. It's what I use the most. The next color is cobalt, and then I've got cerulean. So these are my three blues: ultramarine, cobalt, and cerulean. And I think of cobalt as my central blue. In other words, I can take cobalt and, add a little bit of red, uh, maybe even a little touch of, purple or something, and almost make ultramarine. I can take cobalt and I can add a little white and a little yellow and almost make cerulean. But you can't start with either of the other blues and make cobalt. So that's kind of what I think of as my central blue. Uh, the ultramarine obviously is a little darker and is just slightly dirtier color, but I find it very useful and it has the added advantage of coming out of the tube very dark, which is great for mixing rich darks. If you're mixing it with maybe burnt sienna or one of your reds to make a nice rich dark, that's really useful. So that's the one I use the most, but I have the cobalt on my palette for when I need a little cleaner, purer blue. And I've also got this cerulean blue. Um, by the way, the ultramarine and the cobalt are both Utrecht. Now the cerulean blue, this is the only hue on my palette. It's actually cerulean blue hue. Normally I stay away from hue because it's an approximation, it's not the actual pigment. But in this case, it's simply phthalo blue and white. So I don't know if you've ever used pure phthalo. It's a really powerful color. Just a fly speck of it in any other mixture seems to contaminate the whole palette. It also seems to migrate to your clothes and your car, and it gets all over. But this cerulean blue hue is cut with white, and that really makes it a very manageable and useful color. It does approximate a cerulean color. It's actually brighter than a pure cerulean pigment. And so again, I don't use much of it, but when I need that little extra punch of warm blue, maybe on the horizon line, um, it's handy to have. It can also make some really vibrant purples when used with your cool red. The next color, titanium white. Obviously, you're going to use a lot of white when you paint. There's three basic whites: titanium, zinc, and lead, or sometimes that's called flake white today. Titanium is the most opaque, it's the most reflective. Lead being a little more transparent in nature, and zinc is sort of in between the two. I find the titanium is just a great all-around workhorse. I can do almost anything with it, and it's pretty common for artists to use titanium. Another consideration especially with your white, is the viscosity of the paint. And for years I used Utrecht white, or Utrecht titanium white, but it's got a bit of oil in it. It's a nice buttery, soft white. But I would find sometimes that I wanted a little thicker body to that white. And so I switched to Winsor Newton, which is a much thicker white. It comes out of the tube very stiff, thick. It's great for building up impasto. But for some things, it was almost too thick, and so then I found Lafranc, and that's my current favorite. It's sort of in between the Utrecht and the Winsor Newton in terms of how thick and how sticky it is. And I that's my current favorite, as I say. But just be aware of that. Try some different whites and see what works best for you. The next color is cadmium lemon pure. Now this is my workhorse yellow. You want one yellow on your palette that's a nice central yellow. What I mean by that is I want a yellow that's it doesn't lean toward the cool or the warm. I don't want some cadmium yellow pale colors will be a little on the greenish side. And if you get a cadmium yellow light or cad yellow medium, it's a little bit more orange. I want something that's right in the center so I can bend it warm or cool. That's kind of the essential yellow on my palette. And then next to that, there's a little bit of cadmium yellow light, which looks very yellow next to the lemon. But that's certainly warmer, and it has limited use. But I'll often have just a little bit of it on there. The next color is yellow ochre. By the way, the lemon is Utrecht, and the yellow ochre, I'll use either Utrecht or Rembrandt. They're both pretty close, and they're both quite good. The yellow ochre, again, I don't really use it as an ochre. I think of it as my less intense yellow. A tiny bit of that in in the underbelly of a cloud mixture, for example, where you want to warm up that gray a little bit, but you don't want to make it turn green or, you know, like your lemon might do. The ochre is just a less powerful pigment, and you can kind of sneak up on a little bit of warmth with that. Really nice. Moving on to down the line, we come to cadmium orange. And by the way, you notice the way the palette's laid out. I've got all my cooling agents on the left, you know, my white and my blues. Those are on the left, and then sort of in descending order on the right are my warm colors, descending in both value and temperature. So I think of that sort of as a temperature scale across the palette. Anyway, back to cadmium orange. This is a Utrecht orange, and this is one of those colors that will vary wildly from one manufacturer to the next. I just happen to like Utrecht's value of orange that they produce, and it's a real nice orange. It's one of the colors that I think is not one of my core colors. In other words, I could paint without it. Obviously, I can take my lemon and my red and make a nice orange. But, you know, I live here in Red Rock Country, and it's handy to have. And it's also great for making grays. You know, if I need a nice, you know, I can make just like a battleship gray with my orange and my ultramarine and white, of course. And then from there, I can decide if I wanted lean a little warm or lean a little cool, depending on how much of the blue or the orange I add. So it's a great modifier as well. Then we move on to red. Now this is my warm red. This is Naphthol red. Again, another Utrecht color. And this is very similar to a cadmium red light that you might see on a typical palette. It's just a step cooler than that. It's just a little cooler than Cad Red Light. And it also seems to me to be a little bit cleaner color. You don't really know how to explain that, but you know, it's just it's a cleaner color when you mix it with other colors. And I think it makes some nice, useful kind of muddy purples when you mix it with your blues. And it's just a nice red. So, but I still, even though it's just a step cooler than Cad Red Light, I still think of this as my warm red. Now, a step cooler down the scale is burnt sienna. This is also a Utrecht color. And this is a Utrecht's burnt sienna is very warm. It has a real fiery undertone. If you, you know, if you thin it down, it's very orangey underneath. And so I almost think of it as a darker value of my orange, and sometimes almost use it that way. But it's a very warm burnt sienna. Other brands of burnt sienna typically, not that there's anything wrong with that, but many other brands are a little more earthy. They don't quite have the same fiery undertone, which isn't going to matter unless you're using it sort of transparently, which I sometimes do. So I value that warmth underneath. And it's just a nice buttery paint that works well. And now one step cooler down the line, we've got permanent red violet. This is a Rembrandt color. And even though it says, the name says violet, it's not a violet. It's still a red. It's about as cool a red as you can go without sort of crossing over into the purple family. But it's still a red. And this is my cool red. And so between the cool red and the warm red, the Naphthol, I've got kind of a full range of reds that I can achieve. And this is the permanent red violet is my alizarin crimson replacement. Much like the naphthol red, I feel it's a little cleaner color. Um, it's also a more powerful color, much more powerful than the average alizarin. So you have to use this sparingly. But once you learn to control it, I don't know. I like it. Moving on down to the next one, last in line here is the dioxazine purple. And a lot of people wonder, why do you have purple on your palette? I don't use it as a purple. If I need a purple, I'd much rather mix my own using some combination of my blues and my reds. But this purple is great for modifying other colors. Uh, for example, if I take some of my ultramarine and my cad lemon and I make a nice secondary green mixtures, just kind of a medium green, and I decide, that's a little too intense. I just want to gray it down. I don't want to necessarily cool it or warm it. I just want to neutralize it. Then, going right across the color wheel from green to purple is the way to go. That purple, just a little speck of that, will really nicely neutralize a green mixture. It does the same thing with a lot of my red rock colors. I'll get these kind of sort of muted oranges or earthy reds, and maybe they're just a little too punchy. I need to knock them down a little. A little bit of that dioxazine works really well. Um, Sometimes in the upper part of a sky where it goes a little beyond the ability of ultramarine blue, just a speck of that dioxazine can work really great. So that's my basic palette. Most of these colors, again, I've done lots and lots of color charts, tried all kinds of different brands. There's lots of great brands out there. It kind of depends on what you're painting. These colors are some of the warmer colors out there. Utrecht and Rembrandt tend to be a little bit warmer across the board. Uh, Other brands like Winsor Newton or Grumbacher tend to be a little cooler, and I think of those almost like a little more like Illustrator colors. If I were an East Coast painter, I might prefer Winsor Newton, for example. But since I live in the West, the warmer palette serves me well, and that's what works for me. But in any case, this is a pretty good palette. It allows me to reach almost any mixture I need. And the one thing you'll notice about it is there's no pre-mixed green. Um, I'm one of those guys who just prefers to make his own greens. It's such a large family, the green family, and I could easily have maybe a tube of Viridian or something, and I could learn to neutralize that and make it work. But I find that when I start my greens from the primaries and then I mix something into it to modify it, either warm it, cool it, or gray it, um, then I'm in complete control of that green, and it also just really deepens my understanding of where the core of these colors come from. So that's just my preference, but if you want to have a green on your palette, there's nothing wrong with that. Anyway, the only other thing I'll mention is that I often have a little bit of the Gamblin Galkid gel alongside, and that's about the only medium I use. I don't use a lot of it, but if I do want to thin the paint, do a transparent passage or a semi-transparent passage, I will use that Galkid gel. And then also, you can just barely see it in the corner, but there's a tray there, and that has Gamblin's Gamsol, their odorless thinner. Uh, that's really the best stuff I've found. It evaporates really slowly. It's really odorless. It's pretty safe. You know, if you get it on your skin, it's not going to hurt you. Um, it's a much cleaner thing than some of the odorless thinners that you would get at the hardware store or something. It's also a little easier on your brushes. So there you go. That's the palette that I'm using. I found it really useful. Like I said, occasionally there are a few other colors I will sometimes use depending on the situation. If I'm doing a classical old style, Baroque transparent background, still life, for example, I might want a little raw umber. If I'm doing some figurative work, I may throw a little touch of black on there. It actually makes some really nice dirty skin tones with your ochres and your yellows. But for the most part, this palette serves 90% of what I do, and I hope you'll find it useful too.